Hi, this is Dan, and I'm here to talk about RPG A Day 2021 Day 2's prompt map. And I'm just kind of use map as an excuse to talk about some RPG theory stuff that I think I can use a map to illustrate. So there's an old idea in RPG theory that the core of a role-playing game is exploration. And what is exploration? Like just thinking abstractly in terms of like what does the word mean, right? It's going to a place you haven't been before and seeing what it's like there, right? So obviously this is a big part of classic dungeon delving kind of RPGs, right? You've got the map of the dungeon, you've got your characters, they go in, they see what it's like there. And obviously sometimes it's very exciting there, like there are orcs and other monsters and things like that. So, and for the fun of the video, let's add a third dimension here, right? So we don't just have to stick to a static top-down map. We've got our character, he can go in, see someplace he hasn't been before. But hey, if we're adding dimensions, we can think going in at ground level is going to feel very different than if your character was up near the ceiling, right? They're in different places on that height dimension now, and you're exploring a different place, right? The position of your character has changed. So even though in some ways the situation is the same, in some ways it's different, right? So you're exploring a different place, it feels different, and it's something interesting from a role-playing perspective. But we don't have to restrict ourselves to thinking about location dimensions like length, width, and height, right? We can think, what is it like to enter this place if you've got 1 HP left or a whole bunch of HP left, right? That's also a very different situation. This dimension of how much damage can I take, it's a much more abstract dimension, but it's still a dimension. It's a way that you're positioned in the world. So the little illustration there had some pretty stark differences, right? You can definitely tell the difference between them. But if things are similar enough, human perception won't detect the difference, right? They'll seem the same. If you, as you are now, versus you plus 1 paper cut, it's probably not a huge deal. It's not a perceptible difference in terms of most RPG mechanics. And this is where some games run into a problem if you get sort of a whiff factor, right? So you do something that you thought would make a difference, right? I attack the orc, and then the dice say, well, no, actually, you rolled lower than your 2 hit number, and you don't do any damage, and okay, next turn. All right, you haven't moved to a new location. Now, somebody maybe can argue, well, there's opportunity cost, and the fight is going to last longer than it otherwise would have. But, most of the time in terms of perception, it seems like you haven't moved, and that's why it often feels unsatisfying in a game when things like that happen. And you can also run into this sort of problem if your game does something where, like, instead of failure, it does sort of like success with a complication, right? So you say, oh, I want to pick that lock, and you roll your die, and you get sort of a bad result. And the GM says, well, you do pick the lock, but there's a complication. It took a long time. Yeah. The complication is it took a really long time to pick that lock. Well, if what you've been doing all along is just kind of hand-waving how long things take, okay, that's not a difference, right? It's, okay, it took longer than the arbitrary amount of time I thought it was going to take. Okay, well, that's still an arbitrary amount of time. That doesn't feel any different. So, what's important in a game is what it makes you think is meaningful, and that can be sort of a fuzzy sort of thing. Part of that is what the game decides to make mechanics, because that's often what you're reminded of. But other things factor into that as well. That's where things like theme and tone and setting design really factor in. If you're playing in a setting where family relationships are a big deal, you've got sort of like nobles and families and warring houses and that kind of thing, well, then your position in your family and your relationship with various factions is going to feel like a big deal, even if maybe it's not even mechanically represented. Whereas, some games will just put things into mechanics out of habit, like sometimes like inventory management, and really you don't care about them in play sometimes. So what's meaningful in the game and what's not meaningful in terms of what you're exploring and where you're moving on these different dimensions. It can be complicated, and that's sort of the beauty of role-playing games, and it can also be somewhat tricky if you're not careful about thinking how it works. So those are my thoughts for today. I hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope you come back next time. Bye.